Black. That's the only honest way to describe what the sky over the Oklahoma Panhandle simply became at around 4 in the afternoon on April 14, 1935. Not stormy, not overcast. Black, the way a room goes black when someone shuts off the light. People standing outside couldn't see their own hands in front of their faces. Some later said they genuinely believed the world was ending. This is documented history, National Weather Service records, survivor accounts, and federal soil conservation reports from the exact week it happened. Here's the part most people never hear about, what actually caused a sky to do that. In the next few minutes, you'll see what actually created a storm capable of turning day into night, how fast it moved, and how directly it led to a change in federal law within 2 weeks. It starts years earlier, with a decision that had nothing to do with weather at all. At the time, it looked like nothing more than smart, ordinary farming. Nobody involved could have predicted where it would eventually lead. Through the 1920s, unusually wet years and high wheat prices had pushed farmers across the southern plains to plow up millions of acres of native prairie grass. That grass had held the soil in place for thousands of years, with root systems reaching deep enough to survive drought and wind alike. Nobody plowing those fields in the 1920s was thinking about wind erosion. They were thinking about wheat prices, and wheat prices were good. Here's the strange part almost nobody expects. Replacing it with wheat wasn't reckless at the time. By the standards of the era, it was simply good business. Then, starting around 1931, the rain stopped. A severe, sustained drought settled over the region. Year after year, farmers kept waiting for the pattern to break, the way droughts usually did. This one didn't. Wheat that depended on regular rainfall failed year after year, leaving bare, exposed, loosened soil across enormous stretches of farmland. With nothing left to hold it down, that same soil became fuel for the wind. Exposed and completely bare within a single decade, that's what land that had supported grazing and grass for millennia had become. Here's the part most people never hear about, how these storms actually built up before Black Sunday. By 1934, dust storms across the plains were already a regular, worsening problem, carrying soil for hundreds of miles. Families had grown almost used to hanging wet sheets over windows and stuffing rags under doors just to keep the dust out of their homes. What no one expected was how much worse a single storm could still get. On April 14, 1935, a powerful cold front moved into the region and slammed into the warm, dust-saturated air already sitting over the plains. That kind of collision between a fast-moving cold front and stagnant warm air is genuinely documented weather physics, not folklore. Meteorologists have reconstructed the exact conditions since. That collision pushed an enormous wall of dust ahead of it. Witnesses described it as a rolling black cloud that looked less like weather and more like a solid object approaching. The wall reportedly stretched for hundreds of miles and rose thousands of feet into the sky, moving fast enough to catch people completely off guard outdoors. Farmers who saw it coming from a distance had only minutes, sometimes less, to get themselves and their families indoors before it hit. Temperatures dropped sharply as it passed. Static electricity built up so intensely in the airborne dust that it could reportedly short out car engines and knock people down with a shock just from touching metal. Families caught outside described total darkness in the middle of the afternoon, sometimes lasting for hours before the storm finally passed. Here's a detail worth pausing on. Some survivors described losing all sense of direction entirely, unable to tell which way was home even a few dozen feet from their own front door. Livestock caught in open fields reportedly suffocated where they stood, unable to escape the sheer volume of dust filling the air around them. Inside homes, families packed wet towels along every windowsill and doorframe, and still woke up the next morning with a fine layer of dust coating everything they owned. Journalists covering the region in the storm's aftermath needed a way to describe what they'd just witnessed. An Associated Press reporter named Robert Geiger, writing about conditions in the region that same week, used a phrase that stuck permanently: the Dust Bowl. Here's a detail worth pausing on. That single phrase did more to shape public memory of this entire era than almost any government report that followed. Notice what that naming actually did. It turned a scattered set of local disasters into a single, recognized national crisis with a name attached. Estimates from the period describe enormous volumes of topsoil lifted and carried by storms like this one, soil that had taken centuries to form, gone in hours. No single farmer, no matter how careful, could have replaced what that afternoon alone carried away. Chicago itself was documented receiving some of that same plains dust, carried along by the broader pattern of storms in these years. And the Atlantic Ocean received some of it too. Ships reportedly far out at sea found dust from the plains settling on their decks. Here's the part that still surprises people who hear this for the first time. Soil from a farm in the Oklahoma Panhandle could, quite literally, end up settling on a ship's deck 1,000 miles out at sea. But that's not even the part of this story that moved fastest. Hugh Hammond Bennett, a soil scientist who had spent years warning that this exact kind of collapse was coming, had already been pushing Congress to take soil erosion seriously. Bennett had spent much of his career studying soil erosion specifically, long before most of Washington considered it a serious national issue at all. What no one expected was how quickly Black Sunday actually changed the political calculation. Just 13 days after Black Sunday, on April 27, 1935, President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Soil Conservation Act into law, creating a permanent federal agency dedicated specifically to preventing exactly this kind of disaster. Legislation on that scale, moving that quickly, was almost unheard of even during the broader wave of New Deal reforms already underway. Think about how fast that actually is for a piece of federal legislation. Less than 2 weeks from a single storm to a signed law creating an entire new agency. Bennett himself would later lead that agency, applying the same warnings he'd been giving for years, now backed by federal authority and funding. Here's the last piece of this most retellings skip entirely. Bennett had reportedly been warning Congress about exactly this kind of collapse for years before Black Sunday, largely without the political traction to act on it. Here's what's worth knowing if you've ever heard the phrase Dust Bowl without knowing exactly where it came from. Black Sunday wasn't the only storm of that era, but it became the single moment the entire crisis crystallized into something the federal government could no longer treat as a regional problem. Notice what actually changed the outcome here. Not better weather, but a fundamental shift in how farming treated the land, holding it all together. That shift didn't happen because anyone suddenly became wiser. It happened because a single Sunday afternoon made the cost of ignoring it impossible to deny. Soil conservation practices that came directly out of this crisis, contour plowing, shelter belts, cover cropping, are still standard practice on American farms today. Think about how directly traceable that is. A specific storm on a specific afternoon, still shaping how millions of acres are farmed today. That's the real story, documented in federal records and survivor accounts, and still shaping how American soil is protected today. Every contour line plowed into a hillside field today traces back, at least in part, to lessons this exact crisis forced onto an entire industry. If you want more of these, the real documented crises that shaped American farming, subscribe to The Quiet Farmer. This is heavy history, and it deserves to be told accurately. No invented characters, no dramatized dialogue, just what actually happened, documented. And tell us in the comments, did your family have any stories passed down from the Dust Bowl era?